Okay, hello everyone. Today, I apologize, I'm not going to be able to make it to class. I'm unfortunately not feeling very well, but I want to make sure we get through the rest of the American Revolution because we just don't want to run out of time to get through the Civil War by the end of class. So we're going to continue. It's just a couple of slides and then we should be good. Okay, so let's start with the war for independence. So the main strategy of the British in the Revolutionary War was to capture all the cities and to force the colonists to surrender. And the first part of that strategy pretty much worked. They captured Boston and New York and Charleston, but all the colonists had to do was not quit, which they didn't. They had the home field advantage, knowledge of the terrain, easier supply lines, and so forth. So while the British took the cities, the Americans held on to the countryside. So the most famous battle of the war is probably the Battle of Trenton, which is where Washington was like, I'm going to cross the Delaware on Christmas morning. Washington surprised a bunch of Hessians, which was pretty impressive victory, especially since he had just come off a string of defeats. Hessians, by the way, are German soldiers that were hired by the British. But Washington wasn't able to turn it into an all-out victory and ended up having to spend a miserable winter at Valley Forge. But remember, generals always get to eat, so Washington was fine. Now this painting on this slide is a very famous picture that you will see everywhere of Washington crossing the Delaware. And now what's interesting is that it is riddled with inaccuracies. For example, this flag actually did not even exist during this time period. That flag right there. The boat, that's definitely the wrong kind of boat. The ice is also the wrong kind of ice. It would have been more frozen sheets and not like this. There was zero sun. They were doing this at nighttime. And some of the people in the picture were definitely not there. And then also, of course, there'd be no way that Washington would be like standing like that. He'd fall out of the boat in like 2 seconds. So I just thought I'd show you that and show you kind of probably what would be a more accurate portrayal of what it would have been like crossing the Delaware. And it's something like this. So you can see it is sheets of ice, middle of the night, a lot more people, definitely a different kind of boat. It would have been frozen on the bottom of that boat, so all those people would have been very cold if they actually were, sitting. So, moving on. So the most important battle, at least for the North, was Saratoga. This was the major defeat for the British, and while it's often put forth as an example of the superiority of the Continental fighting man, the British mostly lost because the terrible general lean. So their generals are just bad. Their leadership was bad. The French would eventually bankrupt themselves, helping us, which would lead to their own revolution, which we've learned about a little bit already in class. And of course, we refused to help them with their own revolution. In the South, the city trend continued with the British taking Charleston, but they continued to lose smaller scale battles and be harassed by guerrilla style tactics. The key battle of the war in the South, because it was the one where the British surrendered, was Yorktown in 1781. Lord Cornwallis made the brilliant tactical decision to station his troops on a peninsula, which is, of course, surrounded by 3 sides of water, filled with French ships. So the British lost the war. So what did this all mean for actual people? Well, Americans like to think that we all pitched in together and got rid of the British tyranny and lived happily ever after. Also, that the Continental Army was the bravest, most loyal, and most effective fighting force in human history thanks to the leadership of George Washington. But in reality, the morale among the Continental soldiers was often pretty low. Rations were poor and soldiers went unpaid. And they often felt that they fought for ungrateful people, including colonists who actually fought on the side of the British. So there were colonists who fought for the British. So, of course, they ended up still getting their way in the end. So it was kind of bad blood. Others were pacifists, like the Quakers, who they often had their property confiscated when they refused to fight. And in colonial America, of course, losing property also meant losing their rights. So, unhappiness. And for slaves, the so-called fight for freedom was very different than it was for the Continental soldiers, because loyalty to Britain in the war could mean freedom. In 1775, British Governor Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation that granted freedom to any slave who deserted his master and fought for the British. Probably unsurprisingly, 100,000 slaves are estimated to have fled to the British. Now, many slaves were returned to their masters, but more than 15,000 left the U.S. when the British did. And it's worth remembering that the British Empire abolished slavery in all of its territory in 1843 and without a civil war. Native Americans were also profoundly affected by the Revolutionary War. Generally, they wanted to stay out of it, and the colonists mostly wanted them to remain neutral too. Like the Continental Congress was eager to remind the Iroquois of their history of neutrality, writing, "This is a family quarrel between us and Old England. You Indians are not concerned in it. We don't wish you to take up the hatchet against the king's troops. We desire you to remain at home and not join on either side, but keep the hatchet buried deep." Right. Well, many of the Iroquois fought for the British anyway. The Oneidas joined the Patriots, fighting against the Iroquois. Sometimes there were divisions within tribes themselves, like with the Cherokees. Younger chiefs tended to side with the British, older ones tended to side with the Americans. And it should be mentioned that, unsurprisingly, American troops were particularly brutal to American Indians who fought for the British, burning their villages, enslaving prisoners, and all those are, of course, very contrary to the accepted rules of war. And if the American Revolution was really about, as Thomas Jefferson would have it, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then the Indians were definitely the losers because they didn't get any of those rights. So we know slaves and Indians didn't get much at all out of the Revolution. So how did it go for women? Not great. Some colonial women fought in the war. Deborah Sampson dressed up as a man and fought at several battles, once even pulling a bullet out of her own leg. But women didn't get much out of the Revolution. They were basically still considered wards of their husbands, or if they were married, sellable assets to their fathers. However, the idea of the Republican motherhood became really important. It held that for the Republic to survive, it was necessary to have a well-educated citizens in their territory. And since women were the primary educators, they themselves needed to be educated so they could, to quote Founding Father Benjamin Rush, instruct their sons in the principles of liberty and government. But of course, they couldn't vote or own property. So the war didn't end slavery. It didn't much change the roles of women, and it didn't displace the elite landowning pasty white guy leadership in America. So what was revolutionary? Well, the ideas, of course, a lot of which were summed up in a single sentence of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when the colonies became states, they all created constitutions, which opened voting to more people. While most states still had property qualifications for voting, the bar was lowered. So there were actually more voters than there had been before, although they are still mostly white and male. Another aspect of the American Revolution that was pretty revolutionary was the beginning of true religious freedom. Like with independence, the Church of England ceased to be the Church of America, and some founders, like Jefferson, were deists, believing that God created the world, but then stepped away to create other universes. Jefferson called for a wall of separation between church and state that best embodied in the Bill of Establishing Religious Freedom in Virginia, which Jefferson actually was so proud of that he mentions it on his tombstone. And the American Revolution profoundly changed the economy too. Like all these new ideas of liberty led to the decline of apprenticeship and indentured servitude. And immediately after the war, you began to see the split between the North, with its reliance on paid labor, and the South, with its reliance on slavery. Slavery was actually on the decline in the South until Eli Whitney went and amended the Cotton Gin in 1793, which A, made it possible to turn to profit growing inferior American cotton, and B, reinvigorated slavery. Yay, innovation. So it was worth remembering that some early Americans proposed a vision of liberty that sprung out of the idea of equality of property, which is very different from the way that we imagine liberty today. But ideas of liberty, as diverse as they were, are really at the heart of what makes the American Revolution revolutionary. And that, of course, brings us back to slavery, which things often do. The most common complaint about among Americans is that the revolution was deeply hypocritical. I mean, how could this guy write all men are created equal when he himself held slaves and had kids with one of them? And even crazier, American colonists often referred to themselves as slaves because they were denied the right to have a vote in Parliament about their taxation. Now, some people recognized that this was a smidge hypocritical to claim to be enslaved by British taxation, while they themselves were actually enslaving people. But very few made the leap to say that liberty should mean freedom for the slaves. One exception is a guy named James Otis, who was from Massachusetts, and he wrote concerning American slaves that unless they were free, there would be no liberty. But most of the founders, the cream of the colonial elites, and so they held slaves themselves and made the arguments against abolition. Abolition meaning freedom of slaves. All right, so now after the Revolution especially, there were many and frequent protests against slavery. The most verbose protesters were often African Americans, and in the northern states at least, their pleas were heard. Between 1777 and 1804, all states north of Maryland got rid of slavery, although most did so at a very slow pace and were careful not to deprive slave owners of their value of their property. Like as late as 1830, there were still about 3,500 slaves in the North, and on the eve of the Civil War, there was still 18 in New Jersey. So the number of free people of color in the U.S. skyrocketed. There were fewer than 10,000 in 1776, but by 1810, there were nearly 200,000 free black Americans. So in the end, real change came, as it usually does, not through a revolutionary event, but through a revolutionary process. And to me, the real novel idea that emerged from the American Revolution was of American equality. Now, obviously, this was and remains a vastly unequal social order, but the idea that no one American is inherently better than any other. Prior to the Revolution, the certainty in Europe, there were definitely classes of superior people, especially determined by birth. I mean, people knew their place and they were expected to be deferential to their betters. But all that talk of freedom and inalienable rights introduced the idea that birth wasn't destiny and that all people should be treated with respect, and the idea that no one should be denied the opportunity to succeed because of who their parents were changed not just in America, but actually all around the world. Okay, so there's going to be a couple questions for you after this, so make sure you answer them.